there to text it to me. If possible. I just want to show you the audience.
Are you using this?
Just for 1 second. Okay, thank you. Is there a impartial observer who might keep time? Welcome everybody to the World University Debating Championship ESL quarterfinals. Congratulations for making it here. For the team from opening government, preferred pronouns, please.
Who's speaking first? He or they, please.
And Gigi, she, please.
And opening opposition.
Rivaldi speaking first, he or they.
Gabrielle speaking second, she or they.
Closing government.
Morris speaking first, he or they.
Emma speaking second, she or they is fine.
Closing opposition.
Griffith speaking first, male pronouns.
And,
Rita speaking second, prefer she, her pronouns.
all right. My name is Mike. I will be your chair for he, they. Any other judges want to introduce themselves? Okay.
Rebecca, she or they.
Arena, no preference. Arena, no preference.
Kara will be keeping time to my right. 1 minute, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and 7:15. Without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to defend the motion that stands in their name that this House would prefer a world in which extremely wealthy people in Western liberal states donate excess money to their governments rather than to charities. Hear, hear.
Yes. Dear panel, we think currently... Awkward. Can I start over? Dear panel, we think currently billionaires are monopolizing aid and are monopolizing helping people, which leads to funds being allocated far less efficiency and eventually leads to less lives being saved. We think this is a horrific thing and the government is doing better in many, many ways. There are two things you will be getting for opening government. Firstly, I'm going to explain you why you're saving more lives because money will be allocated more efficiently. Secondly, I'm going to talk about legitimacy, why I think people have a primary responsibility to the state, where we're getting more buy-in at the moment, people are going to believe us. Firstly, what exactly do we propose? So we like the fact that many billionaires donate to charity, like there's an allocation debate of where it should actually go. That's a relevant thing to note. We prefer them to give it to the government. The government is going to do this with it. Firstly, we think they're going to help people like directly themselves, for example, donating money, and see many, many campaigns. Secondly, we're happy for the government to distribute this money over other charities that are not billionaire owned, so not directly Zuckerberg money, but for example, Doctors Without Borders, coordinate of these kinds of things. What we are going to explain, and what we don't necessarily think, is that this money is about like government spending the money on themselves, for example, investing it in infrastructure. Even if that's going to happen, we think Op needs to explain it first. We are also going to explain you why I think that's a legitimate thing to do, why it's still better on our side of the house. Any questions? No? Perfect. So then our 2 points will be simply, firstly, why we help more people. Secondly, even if the majority, even if some of the money is spent on the government itself, why I think that's not too problematic. So firstly, why we're going to help more people. The first thing we should note here is that many money that goes to the state is still be going to use to help other people, right? Firstly, because we think that's how we interpret the motion and simply think how it's worded. Secondly, because the government will be directly pressured into doing so. It will be either pressured by the billionaires itself, who will go donate the money and directly show we are this to help people and we are willing to help people. That's how you're going to spend it. Secondly, you're likely it will be done through the public, who knows billionaires are doing this, know that the billionaires have loads of buy-in. For example, Zuckerberg's post got like a bazillion amount of likes. Governments know this. Government knows that people want to help the money with it. People know that and therefore are probably going to pressure governments into it, right? So this will be redistributed in some sort of way. Why do we think that redistribution is more efficient? We think this is true for three grounds. Firstly, I'm going to talk about incentives both actors have and why it's better on the arse of the house. Secondly, I'm going to talk about overhead, why it's necessary in personal charities and why I think it's a harmful thing. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how you essentially need information for effective allocation and the private charities often miss this. Firstly, Incentives. So idea is this, right? No, that billionaires often want something in return for the fact that they're gaining so much money. There's a reason Zuckerberg didn't just give loads of money away. There's a reason he visited his own charity, gave it his own name, and then wrote a Facebook post about it so the whole world knew, right? They often believe it because for some sort of social capital because they don't want to be appreciated. We don't think that's a bad thing of itself. We do think it has incredibly harmful consequences. Why is that? No, that you get far more social capital and are far more appreciated by society at the moment you have a specific goal, right? You saw that the rhetoric of the Rotary, for example, is incredibly powerful when they say, we solved polio. That's far better than we got an 80% decrease in poverty, right? For the simple reason that's far more intuitive and people think it's far more effectively spent. What does that mean? That means two things. First, you are only going to invest in things that are relatively easily solvable, right? For example, polio, which when the Rotary started donating to it, was already a relatively small disease. What's the point of it? It isn't inherently the thing where we can get most gain, right? So we think we can directly run on that comparative. I'm about to explain why the government is going to make a calculus in which they get most gain. The second thing that's going to happen is that it's going to be relatively sexy things that are completely apolitical, right? For example, if the moment you want to invest in women's education or female rights, Zuckerberg knows that he's taking distance from a significant part of the population that he wants social capital from as well, right? That means only purely apolitical, sexy things are being promoted. We don't think there's necessarily things where most people are helped. Why is this significantly less when we're speaking of the state? First, it is empirically true, right? Now that the state is funding many political things, many long-term sustainability things, right? So I think empirically speaking it's more efficiently allocated. Secondly, we think this makes loads of sense, right? Now that's an incredibly small part of the population that's going to spend their vote on how money is actually spent by the government, right? It's not the main thing people care about, they mainly care about other policy aspects. Now the state wants to help, that's the reason it's donating in the first place. It's often hiring many experts to see how this money is best allocated and how the money is best going to work, right? It means they're far better at making a trade-off and spending money most efficiently. Secondly, on overhead. Now that charities, in order to have one chance of sustainability, needs to invest loads of money in promotion material. We think that's more problematic in many cases because 25% of that money then isn't going to helping people. The government doesn't have this issue given the fact that it's on tax basis and people are going to pay that anyway, right? It means they have less significant cost, it means they're far more efficient at catering money simply because they save a fourth of the cost, right? It means far more money is being spent on actually helping people, that means we make more people happy. Lastly, we think in many cases, private charities miss the knowledge, right? Look for example at polio campaigns in Pakistan, which seemed incredibly effective and sounded great until they found out that the Taliban was opposed to it and put many people in great risk and made the campaign far less effective, right? We think that's less with governments for two reasons. Firstly, we think governments in many cases have this knowledge anyway, right? For example, because it's part of the international relations, because part of the knowing it. Secondly, they have direct access to all the relevant channels because they can talk to people on the ground, can talk to people there, and don't have the issues with overhead, right? That also means you get far less effective help on the our side of the house. Happy to take a PY. Yes.
Governments continuously suffer from institutional deficiencies in terms of bureaucracy, delays, and frozen funds. How is that distinctively more beneficial to maximizing social net benefit?
We agree that they are suffering from issues. We think private charities are significantly more suffering, as was basically the first 5 minutes of my speech. Secondly, even if the majority is going to be spent on the state, why do we think that's still a relatively fine thing? First, we know that many people donate to give something back to society which enabled them to get really rich, right? I doubt Mark Zuckerberg could have created Facebook without Harvard. Harvard is there to a large part because of the US society, right? It means even if some money is going to be flown back to society, we think it's perfectly fine, right? Because they set up the basic framework and they are mainly responsible for the fact that many of these millionaires could actually achieve their wealth, right? We think that's way better on the our side of the house because then that sense of giving back, which is the main purpose for giving anyway, is significantly more relevant at the moment that actor did significantly more for you, right? That means on our side of the house you're more legitimate. Lastly, you get significantly more buy-in on our side of the house. The main argument against giving aid to many people is, well, let's help our own people first, let's help our own elders first, they're in a horrible condition as well. Regardless of whether this is true, it's a thing that many people believe in, and it's currently being important rhetoric in order to prevent people from giving and being excused by people not to give. I think that's significantly less at the moment you are giving it to governments. You're then taking this rhetoric away and get more buy-in from other kinds of actors, which then become more likely to vote. Why do you think that's a good thing? No, that the state, although it has these deficiencies, also can do incredibly useful thing, right? Now, for example, that welfare isn't done by charities, it's done by a state actor, right? Now, for example, that healthcare, especially for people who directly need it, is in many cases done by governments, not necessarily by private charities, right? So even if some of that money is going to the government, we still think it's better spent and properly spent on our side of the house and can be done legitimately. We're proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to open the opposition case. I would ask all the speakers two things. One, please please speak loudly into the microphone for both your speeches, and second, please speak loudly into the microphone for your questions. It just makes it a little easier for us to hear. Thank you.
Members of the House, opening opposition is going to do three things in leader of opposition speech. Number one, we're going to compare the interest of rich people and how does that affect when it's directly allocated to charities in comparison when it is allocated to the government to then be allocated to charities or other related institution. We're going to also argue about how there's an institutional barrier in both sides, but it's comparably easier when you don't have to go to the government's institutional barrier in allocating those charities. I'm also going to talk about how people are going to perceive the world that opening government wants to defend. So on opening opposition, we believe that the world should stay in which most rich people would allocate this to charities instead of the government. We're not opposing the fact that these rich people are allocating to charities because we think that is a better way for us to allocate all of those monies. So let's talk about the interest of rich people and interest of government. We must understand that the interest of rich people in donating their money is usually to get a good image from possible or future consumers of their products and services. So what you need to understand is that most likely they are still going to be willing to allocate all of those monies to charities that are not yet successful or are not yet well known to the public, unlike what opening government say. Because regardless of where you allocate it to, you would still be perceived by your future consumers as a good person and as a business who is fighting for a good cause. So most likely in our world, people would still support you no matter of what kind of charity you're supporting in the end of the day. So they're more willing to absorb all of the risk of donating to charities that are, for example, harder to solve in comparison to charities that are easier to solve. But when compared to the interest of the government, ladies and gentlemen, government also have an interest. It is unlike what opening government said, because government always seek, for example, for re-election or for popular vote. So most likely, because now every person have one vote, it is more likely for these people, for the government to only allocate these monies to institutions whose problem is more well known compared to the other, because that means more vote for them in the future, and that is also against the interest the opening government wants to defend in this case. Misallocation will most probably happen in their world, where the government has more say on which citizens is pleased compared to the other, unlike rich people, even unlike charities, because even though they only allocate to several institutions, but as a whole consumers like the fact that these rich people are donating in the first place, and therefore they're more willing to and that's why we thought that it's more likely for diseases or for causes that are harder to solve to get the money in our world. Now let's talk about government institutional barrier. To the extent that both government and charities directly has barriers, we concede. But remember, the opening government also it's also support where government give the money to charities. So basically on this side of the house, you create two institutional barriers instead of one. But let's talk about government in the first place. We think that the government is in itself hampered with the fact that they are a public institution. What does that mean? That means that most of their money allocation must go through a public discussion that would take a lot of time, given the fact that it is filled with politicians with having different interests and having different priorities to begin with. You must understand that government also care about, for example, foreign relation, which might affect on which country would receive those charities and which institution in that country should receive that charity. It is also very likely for the government to have different interests on which city should get the charity, given the fact that maybe certain states over the other is already partisan or bipartisan, and that affects how politicians wants to cater to that information. So as a result, bureaucracy would most likely hamper the distribution more when it is done in the government system. We agree that charity is also to a certain extent underfunded, but we think that there is a progress in the status quo by the context about the giving the giving pledge, which means that most likely in the world that opening opposition is defending, bureaucracy will become less of a problem because there's a continuous support through this institution to fix all of those barriers, ladies and gentlemen. So we argue that it's still way better on our side of the house because this institution would not be would have sufficient funding and also at the same time are more focused on a certain cause, regardless of whether or not that state or that charity would give more votes or not. And we think that is obviously better in our side of the house. Before I continue,
You seem to care a lot about accountability. Do voters like bureaucracy?
I'm sorry?
You seem to care a lot about accountability. Do voters like bureaucracy?
Yeah, voters don't like bureaucracy, but voters like accountability, and that's why most likely that is used by politicians to always want to debate upon everything in the parliament chamber under the pretext of we want to make sure everything is as transparent as possible and as debated as possible to make everything clear. So most likely, even if they want accountability, debates will still going to happen and arguments are going to still happen on your side of the house, sir. But most importantly, we argue that it's worse off for the public image if you allocate it directly to the government, only to the government. Why? Because you must understand that government is not free from bad image. It's very likely for people to always perceive that government is always under the influence of rich people themselves through the political lobbying groups in determining which sector gets the funding, or at the very least how the government should allocate the money. Most likely the reason why charities or why people wants to go to charity is because of a dissatisfaction on how government allocate their money in the past. We argue that if now all of the donation money is given to the government, the institution that is arguably the cause of all of such poverty, inequality, and misallocation of wealth, most likely, number one, it will discourage the rich to donate as much as they would have. Because if they donate it to the institution that perpetuate that inequality, the image that they will get will be neutralized by the fact that they are donating to the body that is perceived to be under their control through political lobbying groups. But most importantly, you will also lose the support of volunteers that is also as necessary to redistribute wealth, logistic, and engagement to the community itself, because most volunteers want to participate in charities that are independent from the government because they are dissatisfied with how the government allocate the money and how government is working right now. The moment you mix this institution into the government, most likely volunteers would not want to participate because they think that they're still going to work for the same institution that creates all of this inequality, that misallocated all of their taxpayers' money in the past. There is a worse of support for the people who needs the donation the most. We're very proud to open the opposition's case.
I thank the Speaker for his remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government case. Here.
We tell you regrettably that charities are constantly corrupted by celebrities that get to dictate whatever discourse charities have to run, that get to decide what charities have to stand for, that get to decide where money goes to. We tell you there are reasons, structurally, why celebrities cause money to go to wrong places that are popular on a short term, places that are easy to gather money to, places that already have public buy-in, which gives them far more popularity. We tell you governments don't have those incentives. Even if they do, they have them far less frequently, right? We tell you that's why we would like more money to go to governments, more opportunities also for governments to prove how efficiently they can deal with money. That's what we're proud to propose. One big extra contribution for my speech, I'm going to look at an extra factor that limits the ability for charities to efficiently spend their money. Maybe even the most important one, I'm going to talk about sustainability, why it's so essential for charities to be able to do sustainable efforts and why they can't in opposition's side. 3 points of rebuttal that don't quite fit in. Opposition tells you that rich people need a good image, which means for some reason they would want to find charities that are very hard to show tangible results for, right? We tell you that's highly unlikely. We tell you there are three most important incentives for celebrities in terms of how they want to spend their money. Firstly, we tell you they have a big reason to look for charities that can show short-term results, that they can advertise very quickly. We tell you essentially that's even more so for celebrities than for governments, right? Even if you think that voters base their votes on what charity their government gives to, of which my partner already told you that's highly unlikely, we tell you governments at least have 4 years to prove some kind of result, right? Whereas the celebrity wants the result immediately, wants to say in the 5 minutes they have to get likes on Facebook that they've gotten some kind of result. We tell you that means they're far more short-termist. Secondly, they want to go for goals that are highly emotional, right? To get an emotional response from fans, to get some kind of extra popularity. We tell you that means they only search for a limited amount of charities that would give that response, right? For example, diseases that people already know of and give them visceral responses. We tell you that means that all of the charities that don't fit into that very limited framework don't get any money, but also essentially that the charities that do fit into that framework get far too much money and don't know what to do with it, which means that the ALS Foundation had streams of money at once, didn't have the right structure to deal with that at all, which means lots of money goes to waste. But lastly, we tell you the goal already has to be in some way popular, right? Because that goal already has some kind of buy-in with like their supporters already, which means that they don't first have to get people to find that charity interesting at all and then show the results. They already have that kind of support, which means all of these reasons, all of these factors means there's only a very limited allocation of where money goes to in terms of when celebrities get to choose where it goes, right? And then they tell you, but governments have like the voter incentive as well, right? So they're going to go for popular charities. First of all, my partner tells you why voters don't base their votes for like normal elections on what charity their government gives to. Usually that's not most important to them. Usually that means there's not as much pressure on governments to care at all about what they're giving to, right? But secondly, we tell you charities have a far smaller time frame to be popular. I told you why that's true, which means at least governments have some reason to look for sustainable efforts. More on that later. Sure.
Yeah, considering that there are more than one rich people all competing for the same public image, don't you think that it will become not strategic for them to all allocate their money to the most mainstream disease?
Yeah, so there's going to be 10 celebrities that choose the 10 most popular charities. That's still uncomparative, right? We tell you why there's a huge group of like important causes that don't get any money under your side of the house because they're never going to fit into that framework of attractive things for celebrities, right? All right. So then, secondly, they tell you people hate the government, which under our side will somehow hamper their interest to want to volunteer. First of all, we don't really see why, if there would be more money going to the government, meaning the government can show more results, given that they care, as opposition tells you, governments would be more able to show results of all the money that they're getting. We tell you that will probably make it more likely that there's more buy-in to the government, which means all of the efforts that don't necessarily fit into charities in the status quo would become more interesting, right? For example, national poverty is really often something that can attract enough attention to be a charity or an interesting cause, but still is really important. We tell you probably more attention would go to that if you follow opposition's logic. So then, on sustainability, we tell you even if opposition has more money going into charities, the cash flow is totally unreliable, which means projects are never finished, which means all of their money basically goes to waste, whereas even if we have less money going into important causes, that money is well spent, means durable projects, which means actual results, actually the building of schools in places where that's necessary, not just the short-termist, natural disaster help, and more of the efforts that actually help people's lives. So note, we tell you charities need regular income, regular cash flow to be effective. For example, once a natural disaster happens, there are 2 phases of cash flow necessary, right? The first one, also conveniently the one that's easiest to get money for, is the first phase, right? The first probably month, which needs lots of money, but is mostly short-term help, and that money doesn't necessarily go to building sustainable futures for the people in the area. But and importantly, that's where all of the media attention happens, right? That's where there's a hype. That's where there's lots of countries that can build up a lot of money. That's when the money flows there. essentially, when money becomes more important, when it's not only like building short-term housing for people, but actually rebuilding the school or being able to create actual job opportunities, the cash flow stops. That's when the media, it becomes unattractive for the media to spend time on it. That's when and essentially for celebrities as well, becomes harder to show results, harder to give to show actual benefits for money going to that cause, which means projects stop at the most important time of their development, which means half-built schools are left, useless schools by the way, half-built hospitals are left, there's no education for the doctors that they need for those projects, right? Which means all of the money that has gone into it becomes useless. Then comparatively, why doesn't the state do that? First of all, we tell you that voters don't base their votes on what the government chooses as charities to send money to, right? So comparatively, that means the government has an easier job giving money to projects that are actually durable, even if they are unpopular. It means that the government has that opportunity, means that first of all, there's a better spread of charities, see my partner's speech, but also secondly, those efforts are far more sustainable, which means that there's less waste of money. Money is spent better on those projects. Those projects can actually help people. For all these reasons, vote opening government.
I thank the Speaker and call upon Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the opposition case here.
Mr. Madam Chair, we regret the fact that opening government conveniently dismisses my partner's idea. When we talked about how the perception of society, the perception of the larger part of society is important in regards to how we are going to solve all of these causes. Because we're the only side of the House who has proven to you how the society who in the very first place do not trust this entity to disseminate all of these funds, the trust in itself will not be restored just by the existence of this proposal. So in that very scenario, we believe that if it's given to another entity who is way more neutral, who has chosen correctly the entity who will disseminate these sources of funds, it will be better off for society's participation inside those causes. Several engagements to be given out to the opening government. They talked about how these philanthropists will only deal with matters that are easily solvable and it's going to be immediate. Just because it's solvable and they want immediate results does not necessarily mean these causes are less important, ladies and gentlemen. Because you must understand, there are causes which are easily to be solved, but there are also those who are hard to be solved. But it does not necessarily mean these easier causes are not important to be solved, right? And furthermore, we say it's better off if these problems are solved immediately because it relieves people of hardship as soon as possible, right? But even then we say, it provides room for these philanthropists to go on to another causes, ladies and gentlemen. They'll continue for other causes because these altruistic motives is what drives their popularity. For example, it's a gesture the society likes. So we say more people being involved in it, more people immediately solving it, and they will go on to other causes is even a better scenario in my side of the house. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, the Rockefeller Foundation did not stop until they find the cure for malaria in the 1990s. It shows to you that they are not easily solving things, ladies and gentlemen. They do want to maintain their interest to, solve things, be it immediate or not. But at the end of the day, we think that caters to us, to all the concerns coming from OG, right? But even under this scenario, right? If it is true that government wants re-election, most likely government will also want to find things that is solvable because then it will boost their image as well. So we say, ladies and gentlemen, the things that they say is not mutually exclusive in their side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. That is why we think, ladies and gentlemen, in this very scenario, it's what's better off is my side of the house, because eventually we're the side who conceded that both sides, that government or even philanthropists, might have to a certain extent efficacy and inefficacy, right? And therefore the debate should go to the extent of which side will provide more participation from grassroots society in order to support this cause. Before proceeding to constructive,
So the comparative is this. The Rockefeller Foundation gave out Clem Boost. It cost the looks amazing on pictures. A government institution after 25 years of research finally found a cure. Which do you think is more effective on the long term?
look, at least it does solve the problem, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, in my side of the house, it does not necessarily mean that government is stopping their own means of charity. But in my side of the house, at least, the means to solve to solve all of these causes are becoming more direct and becoming more independent, being given out by these philanthropists towards the people directly on the ground who are in need. Let's talk about my positive contribution in this regard. We say that it's going to increase participation precisely from the grassroots society towards the cause. First of all, though, you need to understand why do these causes need participation, right? Because in the status quo, it's hard for people to relate to such causes. It's hard for people in Western liberal democracy to think about trafficking, to think about problems of equality, problems of technological blindness in third world states. They're often drowned within our daily activities because we're too busy with ourselves that this issue never come to our attention. It's very hard for these causes, therefore, to gain sympathizers or even to get media attention, which might galvanize people to be thinking about these causes, right? And therefore, we think this is very problematic when what we need is actually participation out of these people. But why do we necessarily need participation, right? Because these causes exactly need a lot of money. They need a lot of people on the ground, be it volunteers, be it sympathizers who through acts of collectivism necessarily show a certain degree of sympathy, right? That they're trying to feel what these people are feeling in the other side of the world. We think that this participation means that we need to make sure that these people care, and thus it will translate to tangible conducts, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore we say, in order to solve all these causes such as malaria, such as all of these sicknesses, for example, we need to be able to make sure that the grassroots support is actually there. Right? And therefore we say this proposal is going to serve that. How's that so? No, thank you. With all of the media attention that you see from the Zuckerberg Chang Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, it already indicates that people like such thing, right? And we think that when these philanthropists are capable of becoming the media darlings, people will see them as well as the causes and the message that they will convey out of this action. We say that this is a benefit coming from my side of the house because only the mainstream media will be able to continuously update or to continuously cover all of these things being conducted by them. These wealthy people as well will be able to explain why they care about these specific causes which perhaps it's already being campaigned by grassroots community, but it's just less sexy, ladies and gentlemen, because these people don't have the power of popularity behind their backs. So at the end of the day, we think in the very first place, it makes the causes being the society being very much more aware of such causes if these wealthy people actually donate in terms to charities, right? In comparison to the government, ladies and gentlemen, we say that you cannot be able to make sure participation increase if government do it, because most likely government will cover up the people who donate, right? Because they don't want to be perceived as being lobbied by these people. But even if, ladies and gentlemen, government do inform the people who donates to them to donate their excessive money, it's gonna take long. And government is gonna make priorities out of that discussion, as what my partner has told you. Participation will be dichotomized because eventually government will see which charity needs more money, for example, which charity needs less, because then you need to prioritize and allocate money well, right? And we say in this scenario, it's also bad because small causes will not be heard of, they will be marginalized. Meanwhile, when these wealthy people are actually the one doing it, they will always want to become more sensational. They will want more popularity, but exactly pointing to the causes which is very much less heard of. That's why we say it will even out all of these causes, which is very different, ladies and gentlemen, in every areas, right? That's why we see different cases of sicknesses in different areas in Africa, for example, all of which has their own causes and should have their own support. And that's where these wealthy people come in and make sure that these causes are heard. For all of those reasons, you should only vote for OO.
I thank the speaker for their remarks and call upon the member of government to extend the government case. Here.
From closing government, we're going to bring two pieces of extension. First of all, why the total amount of money spent on helping people in the most dire situations will increase, and why it will not lead to a scrutinization of local charities who are far more effective in helping these countries than Western charities often backed by Mark Zuckerberg and etc. Second of all, I'm going to tell you why specifically in these developing countries and why the alternative of development aid and where more money will now be allocated to because that money goes to the government is far better in solving the underlying problems of these countries. Before that, two key points of rebuttal. The main offense of or attack we get from opening opposition to the case is that votes determine also short-term interest. Here's why not. Often within an election, it is not electorally determinative where the money of development aid goes to, given there are lots and lots of issues within government to talk about, and often there's simply not the time to very specifically talk about where exactly it is spent on. What we often only see discussion is about the total amount which is invested in development aid. But with charities, that's completely different, because they need to convince you to go extra beyond the taxes you already pay and directly confront you with that specific issue. So therefore, then you are shown to what you exactly spend on. That's when you get all of those short-term problems, because people are not convinced by simply those short-term problems. The last substantive material you get is you get more attention to these causes. I think you still get a lot of attention when Mark Zuckerberg now declares, I'm going to spend all my money rather than charity on the government. First of all, because still he gets all the positive publicity of the fact that he's actually doing good to people in developing countries and he wants out to help the government. Probably it is even comparatively better because he's making a switch from previously spending that on charities, which makes him seem as far more interesting than previously. So first of all, the decrease of total money. What currently happens is under the status quo is that when these prominent philanthropists say that they want to have a good image of themselves, is they justify why they spend this in this specific way. By seeming as more reasonable and increasing their positive public image, they often scrutinize other ways of spending. So they say the reason I spend on this charity is because the government is not effective, or other ways are not effective, because often is the question asked by interviewers about why they would spend that money on a specific thing. Why is that problematic? Because it feeds into the narrative which currently exists about development aid that it's completely ineffective. The reason why we believe that often is because we don't see the long-term consequences of that. But that is now more fed into at the point where the most successful and the most smartest people within our society say that this is not the best way to spend it. They presumably have spent their money in the right way their entire life. That's because they are the most richest and the most smartest we have. So therefore they carry an enormous amount of authority within society, and therefore you will see an enormous drop. We see a drop in terms of development aid. That changes at the point where they will justify and uphold their public image by saying it's a positive thing to spend the development aid. That's why I'm doing it under the status quo. It's going to increase the amount of total development aid. I'm going to later explain about it's much better. But more importantly, we think we'll lose very little money on charities. Why? Under the status quo, charities reach their goals by the money they are given because of these philanthropists. Therefore, they seem extremely successful in the eyes of the public, and therefore they reach their goals. So there's not a real extra incentive to go for extra money because you're already seen as very successful to those individuals. Now, when that money is taken away, you need to increase advocacy, you need to increase campaigns in order to increase donations. So even though we allocate the money to a different spot, we increase the incentive of charities to get more money on their side, therefore increasing the total amount in total, because they need that money to reach their goals, while they can sit back and already reach those goals on the other side of the house. So therefore more money is allocated. I'm going to now explain why the alternative of development aid is so much better on the other side of the house, but first, APY. You go.
Sir, we think charities have a better incentive to be more efficient if they can compete for, say, like 25 billion from Mark Zuckerberg than compete for like $500 from someone.
They can still compete for an enormous amount of money because all those small donations give combine a lot of money in the first place, so the competition still exists. Why is development always better? Opening government talks about like this is about, for example, short-term things which seem sexy. We say that development aid is the only way which can allocate the government to solve the underlying problems which these countries face. Those problems are within infrastructure. So for example, Bill Gates does a lot for malaria nets, but he does very little for building schools and informing people about like how they can best protect themselves against malaria. That's problematic because you're very unlikely to therefore solve malaria in the long term. Or for example, we see a lot of charities spending on direct disaster aid or not investing in infrastructure to make sure that country is better protected when a disaster comes about. Why is the government crucially the only institution which can increase that infrastructure? Because infrastructure is extremely expensive because you need need to increase it for the entire country across the board. You can't just do that in one single place, because then you're going to be seen as biased. But charities are, like governments, are uniquely able to do that because they get all the money at once from one individual. The money which is currently spent on the states go to charities is dispersed across many different charities who have do not have the incentive to collaborate in those instances. That collective action problem is solved when you have one single actor who's going to spend all the money in the first place. But second of all, we would tell you is that charities need to come with concrete solutions to the problems they're facing. You're not going to give your money to something of which the results you simply do not understand. Simply, you don't get it why building a bridge, for example, is directly beneficial to that country, might be very useful to be better protection because of a disaster in infrastructure. But crucially, governments, as already explained, don't have to overcome that bias in those instances. This last thing I want to talk about is local charities and why we suffer under their house. Even if charities are like the best actor possible, we think the best form of charities are harmed under that side of the house. Why? Because the way in which Mark Zuckerberg and these philanthropists often set up the charities is on the two Western charities. Charities they support and they have the connections with because they know the wealthy in those instances. We think local charities are much, much better. Why? Because they are made up of the people who live in that country and have endured the suffering as most and therefore better understand the most. Even if they say we employ some locals, specifically those at the top and who have the ability to create policy for those charities are not taken into account by those Western charities because often they don't trust them because of the discrimination that exists. Why do those local charities suffer? Because as I explained earlier, those rich philanthropists still have an incentive to scrutinize other forms of charities. While you're doing it through an independent Western fund allocated in the West through Western charities and never say and justify why that's the best way possible was to uphold their public image and their reasonableness. They therefore have an incentive to scrutinize those local charities. Those don't work. Those don't achieve the results. Why we think those are much, much better under our side of the house. That changes under our house when that negative sort of rhetoric is taken away and people have more of a reason to invest in a local charity. So, how have we taken this debate? First of all, we explained to you why the total money would increase. So even if there's a small difference between governments and charities, we get more money under our side of the house. The conclusive reason we gave you is that the underlying problems are best solved and the best form of charities are supported by us. Could not be prouder to propose.
I thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the member of the opposition to extend the opposition case. Here.
Hello? Mr. Speaker, there are three questions at the end of today's debate. The first question is how best to secure more donation. Second question, where best to put this amount of money. And third of all, what is the most effective use of that money to yield the maximum benefit to society in general? Now, our extension covers these three levels in different ways. Firstly, I'll be talking about how, in a more nuanced characterization, what really incentivizes individuals to donate more, rich individuals in particular. Second, I'll be talking about, on a comparative analysis, how there are a lot of inherent systematic restrictions in the government apparatus that stifles a lot of where the funds go and how they're being effectively used. And I'll do that on local and international level. I'll also talk about how this leads to a political culture of rearing rich people in cementing political ideals. And finally, I'll be talking about what's the best scenario for maximizing societal funds, plus what is the more effective use in terms of long-term infrastructural building, which side better guarantees that. My rebuttals are incorporated. First analysis, sorry, this is saving me. Now, first rebuttal analysis in terms of having more donations. The first analysis is about rich individuals wanting to remain relevant in the particular charity progress, right? We think that there are two major reasons why. First of all, there's an alignment of specific goals. The reason why Bill Gates' social welfare program, especially on internet education and on online job creation, is so effective is because Bill Gates feels very, very strongly about these types of agenda and they keep throwing money at it. Second layer of analysis is about personal conviction. Many individuals actually actively bind to particular charities because, no thank you sir, because their goals actively coincide, such as, for example, the Christian United Front for a religious, extremely rich individual. What's more important, ladies and gentlemen, is the question of motivation, right? We think that many individuals, and this is a reasonable characterization because we're talking about rich individuals who do donate, many individuals actually have a personal reason or a personal mission, or they feel very particularly passionate about a particular issue, and this goes beyond any form of financial characterization, and that's what gives that extra push to specifically devote into a particular issue. Let's also talk about self-creating charities, right? We're talking about particular funds that's particular individuals, but for an active role in managing that particular fund would not establish a charity, would not donate that particular fund. That means these funds would either be frozen or they would be used by a particular rich individual. We think that the best case scenario in our paradigm is that there will be brilliant investment strategies benefiting a barrage of different stakeholders, and even in the worst case scenario, we'll still have individuals with perhaps collateral interest in terms of personal gain, but still providing some form of collateral benefit to particular charities. We still think this is better than having funds not being created. Finally, talking about government faith, right? Let's talk about two scenarios. A, where they do have faith in the government and that's why they would donate, and B, where they don't have faith and that's why they won't donate. Where they do have faith, it's probably about a particular, it's reasonable to assume that there is some form of political or economic interest in terms of protectionist policies and propping up. In this case, we think that the donation is premised on other problematic economic policies that lead to negative externalities and collateral harms which outweighs the benefit of particular donations. Where they do not have faith, they're unlikely to donate that much. It's an intuitive logic, right? Moving on to my second substantive on a comparative analysis of the inherent deficiencies in the government paradigm. I'll do this on a local level. Firstly, we think that let's look at local charities, right? How do local charities occur? They occur when the government institution is failing at dealing with particular social welfare problems, and they exist in reaction to that deficiency and try to rectify it on a grassroots or as a less institutional level, right? So we see that there's an inherent interaction or inherent response towards government weakness that puts local charities in a uniquely beneficial role in terms of more focused development. On an international level, OG tried to circumvent the geographical limitations of donating to government by saying, we can still give developmental aids to other individuals, we can still give, redistribute charity to local charities like Doctors Without Borders. Okay, the opening opposition has already made a brilliant rebuttal against this, but we have two extra points in response. We think that even where there are some form of government redistribution, it's still premised on a practical consideration or political consideration in how they can yield maximum governmental benefit. And second, at any rate, we think that these types of redistribution policies are likely secondary on the agenda of the government, and hence there'll be less amount of lump sum money that can actually be taken into the particular market. Before moving on, yes, opening.
All right, so even if personal convictions are a thing, the motion says we would prefer them not to exist. What is the comparative benefit of celebrities donating on the basis of randomly distributed personal preference?
Good. So, the reaction is twofold. First of all, not all extremely rich people are celebrities or seek the celebrity limelight. And second of all, even if they are celebrities, we think that the celebrital status expands across their entire operation of managing a particular charity, right? So their performance is directly related to whether they can get continuous recognition for their efforts. It's not just about a 30-second like on Facebook. It's about a consistent report that their charity is doing something good. So we think that even in this case, they're having massive externalities which are positive, right? Moving on to my other substantive about how best to maximize societally beneficial funds. The question is especially relevant when individual governments use those donated money for social welfare programs or try to rectify things like education, things like healthcare, etc., etc. I've earlier alluded in my POI that individual institutional governments suffer from massive types of bureaucracy and massive types of delays. We have, and I would like to expand this by looking at the immense amount of frozen funds or stalled funds in the U.S. governmental departments in terms of welfare creation. We think that these are clear illustrations that centralized planning is not always good, especially when we're dealing with responsive mechanisms such as social welfare building. Right? Compare with our analysis on how with an active role or a more relevant role for extremely rich people, it leads to, first of all, specialized knowledge and specialized research portfolios that are exported from their business proposal, exported from their business strategy. We also see individuals who are much less enthusiastic and much less capable of bypassing the transaction costs, such as, for example, holding an extra meeting in terms of directly authorizing funds being given in various different accounts, right? So we think that even in our worst case scenario, where it's a dictator, rich celebrity, it can still yield collateral benefits that lead to benefits in the society. Finally, I'll talk about effective use of long-term building, right? They try to assume that all charities are focusing on short-term benefit buildings. We think this is blatantly not true. We think that there are many charities, especially like the Christian United Front, that actively deal with school building, that actively deal with job creation, the exact goals that they're trying to achieve, right? The only thing that they say is that, governments are actually vital to infrastructural building. We think this is false on two main levels, right? Because it assumes that the government would not have money for welfare projects or long-term planning, but for charity contributions. We think this is blatantly not true. Second layer of analysis, we think that still government suffers from the same institutional inefficiencies that differentiate them from grassroots level kinds of charities, right? We've told you in this debate three very simple things. How best to incentivize individuals is about the perception of rich people in terms of how their funds would have a reaction. We think that their personal mission is much more important. We have told you that there are many different ways in terms of comparing how governments are less advantageous compared to a charitable organization. Finally, we've told you how best to maximize its use beyond simply donating to particular institutions. We're very proud. We're insanely proud to oppose.
I thank the Speaker and call upon the Government Whip to close the debate for the bench here.
Thank you, Dan. We think there's a problem if Bill Gates says that he thinks it's incredible, easy solutions have not been found, because he delegitimizes the grassroots organizations opening opposition wants to talk about, because he delegitimizes how difficult it is to build new states. We think Bill Gates didn't solve all the problems he said were so easy, because they're not that easy. Because he said this, we think that it's less likely development aid is given. We think it's less likely development aid to specific local organizations is given. We think it's less likely development aid to the very difficult causes is given. That's why we're extremely proud to propose. I'm going to give a couple of points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about how we get more money in general, and secondly, I'm going to talk about how you spend that money, where we think we both get more and better spending money under our side of the house. So firstly, rebuttal. One, we get the idea of rich people might donate less. One really stupid response, but that's just not really the motion, right? We think that the motion is that we prefer we prefer a world where they give to the government rather than spend it, right? We don't think that really falls within it. But secondly, we think that the idea that people have very strong personal issues and are now able to push this is very problematic, right? We don't think that just because Mark Zuckerberg once wrote like Facebook on a computer, he's very good at deciding what other countries and other cultures need, right? We think of what opposition wants to talk about is people from the West who are now able to fund their personal opinions in other countries. They're going to have to do more than just say, well, it's Mark Zuckerberg. We don't really think he's that good. We think it's very problematic if Mark Zuckerberg can do these things. Secondly, this idea of well, maybe charities can specialize more. First of all, under the government thing that Roel set up, we think it's still possible certain charities specialize in certain things, right? Secondly, we think maybe, just maybe, the government can also have more specialized information. Certain governments, like the Netherlands, could help people fight water problems. Other governments might be able to help people to build up education. We think that's a good thing. We think the Netherlands could do incredible amounts. Thirdly, we get the continuous idea of, well, there's a bureaucracy. Well, I don't know about you, but if Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg combine all their money, that's a load of money. We think if their organizations are probably also going to have bureaucracy, are also going to have good and huge functioning organizations. We don't think that's necessarily true. We, however, think that governments, whilst having bureaucracy, are also more likely to be able to deal with the deeper problems within society. So please sit down. So moving on to the idea of how to get more money. What we tell you is that often when these rich people are talking about why they don't give to the government but try to do it themselves, what they say is, I as a businessman, I as someone who knows how to deal with money, who knows how to deal with money effectively, do not think that the government is someone who can deal with this money, do not think that the charities that are currently there deal with money correctively, right? They don't just donate their money to a local grassroots movement. They keep their money because they want to be able to decide where it goes, because they're best fit to decide where that goes. We think it's very problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that many of these grassroots movements and grassroots organizations are actually quite effective, right? We think Bill Gates sometimes is just false in saying that, but many people don't read up of the Wikipedia page of these grassroots movements, but just listen to Bill Gates because he uses his personal image to like argue for what he thinks. We think that means two things. First of all, we think less people are less likely to give to charities. Yes, Bill Gates might be a rich man, but we think if everyone on the world would donate a couple more euros, we would also get a shitload of money, right? Especially in the Western countries. We think many people in the Netherlands could give far more to charity, but currently they don't, because they don't believe their money is going to a better cause than they would spend it on, because they don't think charities are very effective, because people like Bill Gates continually tell them that they're not. We think secondly, it's very difficult to argue for development aid of the government if you tell the government is very ineffective, right? What Flores tells you specifically is that people vote on how much the government is going to spend on charity. We think if people don't believe development aid works, that's very problematic, because they're going to decide on a very low budget. We think people within the government, the experts who make the decisions, make the decisions where the money goes to, right? We think the public don't generally care. However, we think what Flores brings to you is that they're less likely to give those experts who know things a very big amount of money. We think that's very problematic. I'll take opening.
Why would prospective volunteers continue distributing your aid and engaging in the community if now charity is seen as perpetuating rich people's influence in the government system that causes the problem in the first place?
So if Mark Zuckerberg funds your organization, we also think it perpetuates the idea that rich people decide on organizations, right? We think that's very problematic under your side of the house. So what we say is, under our side, we maximize funds. We make it more likely people believe in development aid. We make it more likely people are willing to fund development aid, give to charities. We think that's extremely important. So how to spend money? So, well, what we get from first half is that I'm going to give first half credits. We think that what first half tells you is that you need this perception of something needs to look sexy, right? That means very short-term ideas and very short-term solutions. What we'll tell you is that a lot of the long-term issues are just simply not as effective and as easy to solve, right? We think building a government, being able to build big institutions and organizations is going to take a very, very long time. If Bill Gates then says it isn't going fast enough, we say, well, it's not going very fast, but we don't think that you can make it faster, right? The only reason Bill Gates might be able to give some malaria nets is because he doesn't fund those institutional problems. We think that means countries are more likely to stay very dependent on development aid, because we need to take 3PYs. Sure.
Government and Bill Gates must have done needs analysis before they do provide such aids, but you must concede that both might not perfectly do it. In my side, at least discourse and participation from society in regards to this cause will increase, and that's a better off benefit.
Okay, so we think that very few people have the influence to vote on what Bill Gates gives his money towards, right? We think if you want people to participate, it's probably going to happen more under our side of the house. We, however, think even more so people are only going to vote for development aid, more likely to vote for development aid under our side of the house. And lastly, your entire op is based on the idea that people in general don't really like development aid. So that means we don't generally think that those people will be very likely to care about what Bill Gates spent his money on. So what we tell you is that it's more likely that people are going to fund these local charities if actually people believe those local charities are doing something. We don't think that Bill Gates tells them to do so. What we moreover tell you that under our side, governments are able to help other governments. The idea of an NGO is that what they're not doing is helping building governments. They're not helping to build institutions. They're not helping to make that country independent. We think that's really harmful. We think that is very less likely under our side of the house. That's why I couldn't be prouder to propose.
I thank the speaker and invite the opposition whip to close the opposition case and the debate.
Mr. Speaker, this is a debate about a comparison between charities and government. On one hand, we see charities as subject to the forces of competition in the private market. They have to compete with one another to see who has the most efficient use of money. On the other hand, government has a kind of monopoly over their government budget, and this is subject to a lot of bureaucracy and backdoor political deals. On the charity side, we see charities are free to donate to international courses, cross-border courses, whereas government have this tendency to prioritize domestic development or whatever issue is more popular with the voter. On our side of the house, charity, when a charity is founded, they're able to stick to one cause and have more longer-term planning and vision, whereas on the government side of the house, how they prioritize their financial aid is more likely to be subject to fluctuation based on short-term election cycles. 3 issues in today's debate. First, which sides get more donations? Second, which side uses money more efficiently and accountably? Finally, which side gets a more equal, just world? First, which side gets more donations? We think that the rich have a lot of, they can potentially spend their money for their own pleasure, like buying luxury items, right? Why do the rich donate? For many purposes. The extension coming out from Griffiths is, we think first, some rich people are genuinely altruistic and they donate for altruistic purposes, right? And it's important to motivate them. It's important to motivate them when they see that their money is able to impact a real change and a direct change, right? Say, for example, Mark Zuckerberg donates $1 billion to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross sends him pictures of how that his money is being used to buy water. The Red Cross sends him pictures of, poor people getting sanitation. We think when the rich people are able to see this very tangible and very direct impact, that 100% of their money is going to a certain community, when they see this direct impact, this actually motivates them more. On their side of the house, they are asking the rich to put their money into a pool of government fund. Well, maybe $1 out of your $100 is probably going to go to the poor, or probably going to go to something else. When the rich don't see a clear end impact of their money, you actually disincentivize them from donating. Second issue that Griffiths, our member, brought up, which has never responded to that, is sometimes people donate because they want to have make a concentrated impact on issues that matter to them. Probably you donate to a fund that studies cancer because your own mother died from cancer, right? Or probably you donate to poverty charity when yourself suffer from charity because of those very individual, personal reasons, right? On their side of the house, there is no guarantee when you donate this money to the government will prioritize the issue that you care about. There's no guarantee that the government will spend money on the issue that you care about at all, right? There's no guarantee the government is going to spend on funding cancer. There's no guarantee the government is going to spend subsidizing education for African American kids. There's no guarantee the issue that you could care about is going to be brought up. So we think they disincentivize those individuals. But second, even if we accept that those people donate for reasons that are other than altruistic, they donate for selfish reasons, which is what opening government wants to talk about. Let's engage with them, right? Basically, opening government says people donate because they want to have a good reputation. Well, we think, good, great, that's great, right? If they donate and they're able to charities and they're able to get media buzzword, they have this incentive to keep donating. Under their side of the house, if the media doesn't report on them anymore, on them donating to charities, they won't donate to the government anyway, right? Well, furthermore, we think that if those people care so much about their image, they're less likely to donate to the government. Why? Because they don't want the media to be saying, those are rich people that are trying to bribe the government or something. We think they're actually less likely to donate. So a second issue I want to talk about is which side gets more accountable and efficient use of money. Let's compare charity versus governments. First of all, we think in the status quo, there's actually a lot of competition among big charities like international charities, right? We think that, for example, the Bill Gates Foundation is competing with the Red Cross, for example, for Mark Zuckerberg's money. And this is actually already an existing mechanism for charities to have an incentive to be the most efficient and to be able to impact the best change and to show a best historical track record in order to convince those rich people, if you put my money with me, I'm the best charity who is able to deliver the best result, right? We think there's already a natural incentive. Versus on the government side, basically you deprive choice, right? Because the United States only has one single government and is subject to a lot of bureaucracy, right? There's a lot of backdoor, closed-door deals versus which constituent gets more money. There's a lot of political inefficiency. Secondly, let's compare long-term versus short-term. Because we heard from the opening government, we want, some kind of long-term planning. We think actually on their side of the house, money is likely to fluctuate more. Why is that the case? Say, for example, in the Obama election year, the topic of healthcare was highlighted in elections. People care more about healthcare, and suddenly we see a lot of rich people, including politicians, corporations, donating to healthcare. In another election cycle year, maybe it's post the Iraqi war, and people start talking about veterans. Suddenly you have a greater inflow, a greater portion of government budget allocated to care for veterans. We think how governments prioritize their budget is highly subject to short-term fluctuation. It's likely that poverty gets 1 million today, this year, but then in the next election cycle gets 0. Right under our side of the house, say for example, when you have an organization like, say, the Red Cross, which prioritizes on providing humanitarian aid, they have a founding vision at the start of their charity, and they commit to donating money to this particular one cause. That's why we think on our side of the house, we actually have more consistent financial flow to one particular cause. Yes, opening.
So
So why would charities compete on the basis of relevant but hard to achieve factors as efficiency if they could also rely on visceral reactions to the cause they pick, given that charities monopolize specific causes as well?
Well, madam, we think first of all, if there's only one charity in the world for one particular cause, we actually create an incentive for more charities to be founded because they see there's more money that they can potentially compete for more money, right? On your side of the house, you don't get any kind of competition when the government monopolizes. The final point, another thing I want to talk about on accountability is because your side of the house, starting from opening government all the way down the bench, talk about how when rich people donate to charities, you get a lot of media attention. That's actually another form of media accountability, right? Because we think, like, for example, you have reporters like looking over the financial statements, report, and all kind of thing. We think the media accountability is another form of accountability that we get on our side of the house. Third thing I want to talk about, which side is a more equal or just world, right? Because we think, which is something we brought them up, they never responded to. We think when domestic governments decide how they allocate money, sometimes it's subject to a lot of political incentive, right? Say, for example, the US has an incentive to probably provide international aid to Israel, but never has an incentive to provide aid to poor people in Palestine, just because Israel is an important ally with the US and Israel doesn't really like Palestine very much, right? We think on our side of the house, we give rich people the channel to bypass those kind of political incentives. At the end of the day, we think we're the side of the house that gets more donations and this money is used more accountably. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker, thank all the speakers for a wonderful debate. Ask everyone to leave the room and we will adjudicate.
Well done. Great speech.
Well done.
Well done. Great speech. Well done. Hey, good speech, man. Well done.
I could someone's photo down. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Zo trots op jullie.
Je was echt tering goed. Jullie waren echt goed gedaan.
Jullie waren zo on.
Gewoon letterlijk ieder meegelezen wat we hadden. Ieder
Ja. Nou, het is wel vervelend als je dan... Nou, je hebt wel lekker al ik zit gestopt.
Ja, want gewoon letterlijk al jullie Wat? Ja. Heel grappig.
Okay, I'm gonna go with Jordan.